A single bullet in Sarajevo did not cause World War I. It dropped a fuse into a house already stacked with explosives. That is the first shock most history books quietly avoid. What looks like a sudden eruption was, in fact, the predictable result of decisions, timetables, and secret bargains that turned routine diplomacy into an engine of annihilation. By the time politicians finished reading their orders, armies had been set in motion on schedules that left no room for second thoughts. A local murder became a global war because systems designed for deterrence became traps for escalation. Here are the four uncomfortable truths we'll unpack. First, the alliance system and military timetables made escalation almost automatic. Alliances were not merely political friends, but mechanical triggers. Second, industrialized warfare transformed strategic objectives into industrial slaughter. Technology and logistics remade politics into attrition. Third, the war was not confined to Europe. It extended across colonies, deserts, forests, and oceans, shaping a truly global catastrophe. Fourth, secret diplomacy and broken promises remade borders and hopes overnight, planting political seeds that would sprout into revolution, collapse, and bitter settlement. Each of these points is less a revelation of conspiracies than a revelation of structure, how ordinary choices, hidden deals, and institutional rhythms multiplied the human cost. On June 28, 1914, the assassination in Sarajevo provided an immediate catalyst. The heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne was shot by a young Bosnian Serb nationalist. The event was violent, dramatic, and contained the moral clarity that makes a single act look like the cause of everything that followed. Yet what followed was not merely punishment for a crime. It was the enforcement of a political logic that had been hardening for decades. Vienna saw an opportunity to confront Serbia. Berlin saw an ally to support. Russia saw a Slavic interest to defend. France and Britain watched with growing unease. Within days, the diplomatic language hardened into ultimatums and mobilization orders. Once mobilizations began, planners who had drawn the maps and timetables realized that stopping was not an option without facing catastrophe on the battlefield. What few textbooks make vivid is how central military timetables were. The German General Staff had a plan designed for one strategic purpose: to defeat France quickly before turning east against Russia. That Schlieffen-inspired blueprint did not sit inert on a shelf. It shaped political choices. Mobilization meant more than calling up reserves. It meant rail timetables, punctual troop transfers, stockpiled ammunition moving to staging areas, and timetables that assumed an enemy's equally fast rhythm. To begin mobilization was to begin war planning in earnest. Diplomatic signals that would once have bought time, protests, pleas, bargaining, often arrived after the trains had already left the stations. This is the second uncomfortable truth. Alliances that promised protection also came with binding obligations that, in practice, limited discretion. The Central Powers and the Entente were networked not only by treaties, but by plans. Allies expected one another to act. Military staff expected timetables to be honored. That expectation hardened into a kind of mechanical reciprocity. The assassination did not create the alliances. It simply exposed that the alliances had been transformed into instruments that made escalation easier than restraint. Consider the sequence. Austria-Hungary issued a stiff ultimatum to Serbia, demanding concessions so severe that they would have undermined Serbian sovereignty. Backed by Germany's diplomatic assurances, support the Habsburgs might not have had otherwise, Vienna lodged the demands. Serbia's response was conciliatory, but not fully compliant. Vienna declared war. Russia, bound by its role as protector of Slavic interests and fearing the implications of a Habsburg victory for its own influence, began partial mobilization. Germany, interpreting Russia's mobilization as an existential threat and aware that its own plans demanded speed, ordered full mobilization and enacted pre-war war plans. France and Britain watched the growing movements and the violation of Belgian neutrality. Britain, bound by moral and treaty obligations to Belgium and concerned about continental hegemony, declared war when German forces advanced through Belgium. Within weeks, what started in the Balkans spread across the continent and onto the oceans. The third shock is in the mechanics. Mobilization timetables made diplomacy a hostage. Military plans depended on rail schedules and stockpiling that took weeks or months to prepare. Once a nation began, the window for diplomatic negotiation narrowed until it almost vanished. The same impatience that fed the first mobilizations fed subsequent ones. Leaders who might have preferred to de-escalate found themselves confronted with the reality that stopping armies already in motion would likely invite defeat. A timetable that promised swift victory for one side turned into a cycle where inaction was blamed for losing strategic advantage and action meant irreversibility. By August 1914, Europe's military culture, its doctrine, railway timetables, and mobilization norms had turned a crisis into a continent-wide conflagration. The Schlieffen-inspired attack through Belgium aimed at quick success, but the invasion itself created a diplomatic trigger. Britain's guarantee of Belgian neutrality was not merely a legal clause, it was a political and moral line that the British government felt compelled to enforce.
The violation of Belgium did more than draw Britain in. It hardened public opinion and gave the conflict a moral narrative that obscured the structural causes. Yet the moral narrative also masked the technical reality. Strategic plans had turned sovereign decisions into timed maneuvers that left next to no room for peaceful revision. Once open warfare began, expectations of a short, decisive conflict dissolved faster than any armistice hopes. Commanders and statesmen alike had imagined wars of movement and quick victory. What they had not fully considered was how modern firepower, artillery, machine guns, and defensive fortifications would blunt advances and convert maneuver into grinding attrition. The early battles, the German push through Belgium, the Battle of the Marne, the first battles of Ypres, revealed the mismatch between hopes and reality. The French and British managed to halt the German advance at the Marne in September 1914, but that tactical success did not translate into strategic closure. Instead, armies dug in. Trenches, barbed wire, machine gun emplacements, and interconnected defensive systems began to dominate a front that stretched from the English Channel to the Swiss border. What many observers had regarded as a temporary line hardened into a long-term system of entrenchment. The moment where mobility gave way to stalemate marks the fourth shock. The war's nature shifted from a political instrument to an instrument of industrial attrition. The battlefield, ceasing to be a zone of decisive, quick engagements and becoming instead a laboratory for industrial-scale killing, is a transformation with moral, social, and political consequences that textbooks often understate. When war becomes a contest of industrial capacity, who can supply more shells, more men, and more rail cars, the calculus of victory changes. It is no longer about strategic finesse alone, but about sustaining a logistic and manufacturing effort that can outlast the opponent. It is necessary to pause and imagine what industrial slaughter actually meant in practice. It was not simply more weaponry. It was the integration of mobilization, rail logistics, artillery doctrine, and munitions factories into a single economy of death. Field tactics adapted. Massed infantry assaults became common because artillery doctrine favored softening the enemy with prolonged bombardment, followed by waves of troops crossing no man's land. The lethality of machine guns and barbed wire made crossing open ground catastrophic. The result was a feedback loop. Failed assaults produced more need for artillery preparation, which consumed more shells, which intensified demands on factories and labor, which in turn deepened the social integration of entire populations into the war effort. The weapons were new in scale, if not always in kind. The scale made the experience qualitatively different. If this all sounds abstract, consider the earliest months in concrete terms. Towns emptied. Rail stations thrummed with the movement of reserves. Factories retooled for shells and uniforms, and young men were swept up in waves to the front. The Marne stopped a German sweep, but did not resolve the war's logic. Fighting in late 1914 shifted into a protracted contest for inches of earth. Ypres became a name associated with mud and gas. The Somme would later become synonymous with failed offensives and massive losses. Yet even in those early months, commanders and politicians struggled to adjust to the new normal. Tactical setbacks were soon replaced or exaggerated by the need to maintain morale and domestic support, while societies reorganized around a long-term conflict economy. A second set of realities, often minimized in elementary accounts, is the global reach of the conflict. It is tempting to tell World War I as a European tragedy. Structural racism, imperial blindness, and diplomatic secrecy make that temptation easy. But this was truly a world war in the literal sense. Colonial troops were mobilized, theaters opened in Africa, the Middle East, and the Pacific, and naval campaigns played out across the oceans. Governors and commanders in Berlin, London, Paris, and Constantinople long understood that colonies were not peripheral. They were essential resources and strategic points. Troops from Africa marched in German East Africa. Indian regiments fought on European soil. Campaigns in the Middle East would redraw borders and set the stage for future conflicts. This global character of the war forced European powers to stretch their logistical and political commitments beyond familiar borders. It turned what might have been a continental struggle into a conflict of empires, influencing populations who had little say in the metropole's calculations. It would later become a foundational grievance. Colonized peoples who fought and suffered expected recognition and rights in return, while wartime promises and secret agreements often left them disappointed. The naval and maritime dimensions added another layer of consequence. Britain relied on sea lanes for food and raw material. Germany had invested in a navy that could threaten those lines and disrupt global trade. The British blockade aimed to strangle Germany's economy and limit supplies reaching both military and civilian populations. The blockade's impact was not limited to military provisioning. It touched civilians in a way that European-centric narratives frequently downplay. Food shortages and the economic effects of the blockade contributed to suffering on the home front that would have political consequences. Germany's response, the use of submarines in an unrestricted campaign against Allied and neutral shipping, escalated the stakes. When a passenger liner carrying civilians was sunk with many non-combatant fatalities, the consequences reverberated across the Atlantic and sharpened U.S. opinion. The Zimmermann telegram, in which German officials proposed an alliance with Mexico against the United States in the event of U.S. entry into the war, was intercepted and leaked. That secret note added to the perception that the war would not remain a European affair and helped push a hesitant United States into active participation. The naval duel, therefore, had strategic outcomes. It turned economic warfare into political leverage and expanded the war's diplomatic dimensions. At the same time, technological innovation accelerated the transformation of combat. Artillery evolved into the dominant killing tool. Machine guns made open advances devastating. Poison gas introduced a new form of suffering. Aircraft moved from reconnaissance platforms to platforms for bombing and tactical support. And tanks, embryonic at first, pointed toward new ways to approach entrenched positions. Each innovation changed both how battles were fought and how societies perceived the legitimacy and horror of modern war. The psychological shock of seeing massed formations reduced by industrial firepower affected soldiers and civilians alike, creating a pervasive sense that traditional limits on violence had been shattered. And this is the fifth sobering truth. Even as technology advanced, political aims often remained limited or ambiguous. Many leaders entered the war with constrained objectives: territorial adjustments, security guarantees, the defense of honor or treaty obligations. What they did not foresee was how those limited aims would be swept under the tide of attrition. The longer the war went on, the more political aims inflated or hardened to justify continued sacrifice. Governments that had expected short campaigns found themselves needing maximalist rhetoric to keep wartime economies functioning. The link between a society's endurance and its victory became the narrative that justified an ever-increasing human cost. None of this should be read as fatalism. Leaders made choices. Publics accepted rhetoric. Generals interpreted doctrines in their own ways. But the structural forces, mobilization timetables, alliance expectations, industrial production capabilities, and the diffusion of new technologies created an environment in which small decisions were amplified. What looks, in hindsight, like a cascade of folly was in many cases the result of institutions acting on pre-existing plans. That institutional momentum is often absent from schoolroom narratives that focus on personalities and one-off mistakes. By the fall of 1914, several enduring images had formed. The mud of the trenches, the mass graves of failed assaults, the catalogs of small tactical gains at enormous cost. Yet beneath those images lay diplomatic maneuvers and secret commitments that would reshape the post-war world.
While soldiers dug in for a long winter, diplomats were drawing maps, sending secret notes, and promising support to various factions. These behind-the-scenes bargains would later have enormous consequences for the Middle East and beyond, particularly where wartime assurances to Arab leaders clashed with secret agreements between European powers. Those contradictions would not wait for the armistice to have consequences. They were already fermenting in letters and cables, in embassy rooms and colonial offices, often shielded from public scrutiny. Pause for a moment and consider the human scale. Millions of men enlisted or were conscripted. Societies mobilized entire economies. Women entered factories and offices in unprecedented numbers. Towns that once existed as quiet market centers were transformed into transportation hubs for troops and munitions. Families waited by radios and newspapers for casualty lists they feared to find. The civilian experience of war began to converge with the military experience. Hunger, fear, loss, and the ever-present anxiety that borders drawn by diplomats would affect daily life in ways that no one could yet predict. Here we reach a hinge. The early months of fighting had established patterns. Escalation through mobilization, the rapid collapse of hopes for a quick war, entrenchment and industrialized killing, global involvement, and the hidden diplomacy that would shape post-war settlements. The narrative that follows is not simply one of battles and victories, but of how structures redefined power, suffering, and political possibility. In practical terms, these patterns made the war longer, deadlier, and more politically consequential than planners had imagined. If this framing resonates with you, and you want the complete evidence-based deep dive, including primary sources and maps, subscribe now. Sources are linked in the description below. Stay with us. The next sections trace the key set-piece battles and the innovations that turned military theory into mass death, and then move into the forgotten theaters where the war's global reach produced outcomes rarely taught in standard classrooms. The winter of 1914-1915 was its own kind of frontier. While diplomats schemed and public opinion hardened, armies adapted to a new normal. The trenches expanded and deepened. Communications and supply systems became critical lines as vital as any front line. Commanders on both sides sought ways to break the deadlock. Some turned to artillery barrages designed to pulverize enemy defenses. Others experimented with small unit infiltration tactics. New weapons, crude tanks, long-range artillery, aircraft dropping improvised bombs were rushed onto the field, sometimes with startling tactical surprise, but often with inadequate doctrine or support. The battlefield became a site of continuous technical experimentation. In February 1915, as commanders weighed options, another front opened that would force a reassessment of strategic priorities, the Dardanelles. The Allied plan to force the Straits and open a supply line to Russia reflected both military ingenuity and political desperation. A successful campaign there could knock the Ottoman Empire out of the war, open an eastern front against the Central Powers, and relieve strains on the Western Front. Yet the Gallipoli operation would expose the limits of amphibious warfare against prepared defenses and the consequences of underestimating local geography and determination. The campaign turned into a costly prelude to the wider pattern: tactical ambition colliding with modern defensive power, and political calculations yielding heavy human consequences. While Gallipoli unfolded, other theaters pulsed with their own violence and strategic logic. In Africa, British, French, Belgian, and Allied colonial forces clashed with German colonial armies, including mobile guerrilla campaigns in East Africa under commanders who used terrain and persistent mobility to resist superior forces. Von Lettow-Vorbeck's campaign, in particular, demonstrated how the logic of asymmetric warfare could strain imperial resources and draw attention away from European fronts. Colonial subjects were not merely spectators. They were combatants, porters, laborers, and victims, and their experiences would later fuel political claims for rights and recognition. Back in Europe, the war of positions intensified. Commanders grasped for any means to gain advantage. In April 1915, the introduction of poison gas by one side marked a grim escalation. Gas was not instantaneously decisive, but its psychological effect, the suffering it caused, and the way it added a new dimension to the battlefield stunned soldiers and civilians alike. The move toward chemical warfare illustrated a broader pattern. When confronted with stalemate, belligerents turned to technological escalation to break deadlocks. What followed was an arms race across many domains: heavier artillery, refined gas agents, mechanized vehicles, each innovation intended to create a new advantage, but also feeding the arms spiral. The human consequences were immediate. Soldiers faced new types of wounds and slow deaths. Medics were overwhelmed. Surgical techniques evolved under pressure. Societies adjusted too. Recruitment drives, war bonds, and rationing systems expanded state reach into everyday life. The front line and the home front were connected by a continuous flow of resources, news, and grief. National economies shifted priorities toward war production, and labor became a front line for national survival. In countries whose industrial base was less developed, shortages and inflation produced social unrest and political instability that would later reshuffle governments. As 1915 moved into 1916, none of the patterns that began in 1914 had been reversed. Instead, new patterns layered over the old. Diplomatic secrecy deepened as governments sought to secure advantages that would become bargaining chips after the fighting stopped. Colonial administrators balanced suppression and recruitment. Military staffs refined their doctrines to match the new realities of sustained industrial warfare. The scale of what was at stake, economic capacity, political legitimacy, and national survival, made retreat difficult. The war was no longer an expression of short-term policy goals. It had become an existential test for many participants. And yet, even as the war hardened into patterns, the rhetoric of decisive victory persisted. Political leaders continued to make maximal claims: to restore honor, to crush aggression, to secure lasting peace through victory. That rhetoric fed a loop where continued sacrifice seemed the only pathway to a better peace. The paradox was that the longer the war lasted, the more difficult it became to fashion a peace that matched wartime rhetoric without imposing unsustainable burdens on the vanquished. This tension between wartime aims and peacetime feasibility would burst into public view only after the guns fell silent. But its roots were visible even in the trenches and diplomatic cables of 1915 and 1916. Before we move into the great set-piece battles, Verdun, the Somme, Passchendaele, and the political storms they would provoke, it is worth returning to the central claim. The shock of World War I is not purely that nations fought or that millions died. The deeper shock is that ordinary institutions, alliance treaties, mobilization plans, industrial economies, colonial administrations, and secret diplomacy collectively produced a war of a scale and character that few contemporary observers had fully grasped. To understand the war is to follow not only the parade of generals and ministers, but the rails, factories, telegraphs, and treaty clauses that made war at once a political instrument and a mechanical inevitability. In the chapters that follow, we will trace those set-piece battles where the new logic of industrial slaughter became undeniable, and then move outward to examine the global theaters and the secret bargains that shaped the post-war map. We will look at how blockade and submarine warfare reshaped civilian life, how colonial troops and campaigns altered imperial relationships, and how secret promises made during the war fed later anger and upheaval. But first, a closer look at how the Schlieffen-inspired planning and the doctrine of offensive movement collided with the emergent reality of modern defense. The collision began as a tactical and operational problem: how to get men and guns to the decisive point under the weight of modern firepower, but quickly became a political one. Commanders who needed to preserve their reputations and states that feared the consequences of rapid withdrawal were predisposed to press on. The result was a series of encounters in 1914 whose outcomes were measured not only in territory but in the reshaping of expectations about what war would mean in the 20th century. At the same time, new diplomatic machinations were quietly reshaping future maps. In rooms far from the trenches, negotiators exchanged notes that promised or denied national aspirations. Some of these conversations were explicit, others were guarded or even secret. The consequences would be profound. Promises made to local leaders or secret understandings between imperial capitals would collide with each other and with the lived realities of those who had fought and died. In that collision lay much of the post-war instability, the disintegration of empires, the birth of new states, and the emergence of unresolved claims that would echo into the next decades. As winter gave way to spring, the battlefield remained stuck, but the war's margins began to expand in ways that would make the conflict harder to contain. In the chapters to come, we will follow these expansions: the major offensives, the introduction of new weapons, the widening of the naval conflict, and the political shifts at home that began to test the endurance of governments. We will show how, paradoxically, a war fought to secure nations' futures destabilized the foundations of those very nations. If the first months taught one lesson, it was this: systems can be as lethal as generals. The lethal capacity of institutions when mobilization schedules, alliance obligations, industrial logistics, and secret diplomacy combine is the central theme of the war's early history. The rest of the story will be about how those systems were tested, adapted, and broken, and how millions of lives were consumed in the process. What happened next would confirm the initial horrors and deepen them: set-piece battles that became symbols of futility, the escalation of weaponry, and a political unraveling that reached from St. Petersburg to Constantinople and from Berlin to colonial Africa. The war's logic, once set in motion, pressed relentlessly forward. The shelling at Verdun, the mud of the Somme, the hollowed faces of the men who survived Passchendaele. These are the images that tip the balance between any attempt to explain the war and the reality of living through it. What made those images possible was not a single decision on a single day, but a sequence of choices, doctrines, and institutional rhythms that had been accumulating for decades. In 1916 and 1917, that accumulation reached a brutal clarity. Commanders and governments adjusted methods, not aims. They intensified means to break a deadlock the institutions themselves had helped create. Verdun was not simply a battle over a ridge. It became, in the minds of many German planners, an attempt to force France into a grinding attrition that would bleed the enemy of men and materiel. Whatever the language used by particular staff officers, the operational reality was unmistakable.
For months, the fortress-like symbolism of Verdun was subjected to unrelenting bombardment, and the French defense was forced into a calculus of survival measured in the ability to rotate divisions, conserve ammunition, and hold symbolic ground at almost any cost. The German High Command, aware that numerical parity favored no easy breakthrough, accepted the idea that a protracted grinding could alter the balance. The French response, organized in part under commanders who understood that Verdun must be held to sustain national morale, consumed enormous human resources. Petain's stewardship of the defense, his rotation system, his attention to supply lines and rest for troops helped keep the line, but at the price of extraordinary human attrition. Verdun thus stands for an essential truth of the mid-war years. Attrition, by design or necessity, became a strategic method. The Somme that followed was in many ways an Allied attempt to relieve pressure and impose a different kind of attrition on the German army. It was also, crucially, the battle where industrial preparation met youthful human bodies and did not always translate into tactical success. The Somme offensive saw massed artillery barrages that consumed prodigious quantities of shells. It saw the debut of armored vehicles that promised to cross barbed wire and absorb machine gun fire. And it saw waves of infantry assaulting prepared defenses under conditions the artillery could not entirely neutralize. The result was a catalogue of partial gains and enormous, immediate human loss. The Somme made manifest a bitter lesson. Numerical superiority and technological preparation were not sufficient to overcome entrenched firepower without doctrinal adaptation and tactical innovation on a much larger scale. Passchendaele, the Third Battle of Ypres, compounded the calculus. In the autumn rains, mud turned shell-churned fields into a viscous killing ground. The campaign was as much a test of logistics as of arms. Supply lines saturated, artillery positions sinking into mire, the wounded trapped in pitted no-man's land. Political pressure, the desire to relieve pressure on other fronts, and the belief that the enemy might be broken converged with the brutal geography of the Flanders Plain. The battles of 1916 and 1917, taken together, demonstrated a pattern. When simple maneuver failed, states and generals turned to increasingly disruptive and costly measures, each intended to be decisive, but more often amplifying the war's steady toll. That steady toll had consequences beyond the immediate battlefields. The mid-war years saw the fraying of morale, the politicization of sacrifice, and the emergence of social pressures that even powerful governments struggled to manage. In France, failures and staggering losses produced a crisis of confidence that culminated in the 1917 mutinies after the failed Nivelle offensive. Radical responses, both punitive and reformist, followed. In Britain, the disquiet of 1917, the crises over munitions and manpower, and the demands on the home front pushed political leaders to rethink their strategies and their social compact. Germany's economy, increasingly strained by blockade and manpower shortages, began to crack at the seams. The link between home and front became inseverable. Rationing, factory discipline, and patterns of female labor tied civilian life to military endurance. If the war in Western Europe became a drama of attrition, the war's global dimensions complicated both strategy and politics. Campaigns in Africa, the Middle East, and the Pacific were not peripheral footnotes. They were integral to imperial calculations and to the war's logistics. In East Africa, a relatively small, mobile German force under Paul von Lettow-Vorbeck refused to be pinned, keeping large numbers of Allied troops tied down and demonstrating how asymmetric operations could frustrate conventional superiority. Colonial subjects, from Indian regiments in Europe to African troops and carriers in multiple theaters, played crucial roles. Their experiences would return to haunt imperial centers. Promises made, sacrifices given, and expectations raised created a post-war environment in which the rhetoric of service and reward would collide with the reality of imperial maintenance. The Ottoman front transformed strategic assumptions in the Near East and beyond. Gallipoli showed how amphibious operations against well-prepared positions could fail with catastrophic loss. The campaign reflected both military miscalculation and political desperation. For the Allies, the hope of opening the Dardanelles and relieving Russia never materialized. For the Ottomans, the defense helped solidify a wartime narrative of existential resistance. But Gallipoli's human cost, from Anzac troops to Ottoman defenders, underscored a broader consequence. The war's margins were no less lethal than its European center, and the resulting political effects would be profound. Maritime power and economic warfare were another axis where the war's indirect effects produced tangible suffering. Britain's blockade of Central Powers ports aimed to choke raw materials and foodstuffs. Its logic was clear in strategic terms: degrade the enemy's ability to wage war, but its effects reached deep into civilian life. Food shortages, malnutrition, and economic dislocation struck populations already taxed by conscription and the diversion of resources. Germany's eventual turn to unrestricted submarine warfare was a direct response to this pressure. By attempting to cut Allied supply lines and frighten neutrals, German U-boats escalated the conflict into a maritime crisis that blurred the lines between military and civilian targets.
The sinking of large passenger ships with civilian casualties, episodes that shocked neutral publics, hardened opinion across the Atlantic. The interception and exposure of secret diplomatic overtures, most famously the Zimmermann telegram, made clear that the war's reverberations were no longer contained within European corridors. When the Zimmermann message, proposing an alliance between Germany and Mexico if the United States entered the war, was revealed, it helped shift American sentiment decisively. Combined with submarine attacks and economic ties to the Entente, the result was American military intervention that would, within a year, change the balance of manpower and industrial capacity on the Allied side. The United States entry illustrates a recurring wartime paradox: local choices produced global consequences. A German decision to use submarines widely, intended to starve Britain and pressure the Entente, played directly into a diplomatic sequence that brought an extracontinental power into the fight. That addition, in turn, fed the dynamics of 1918. American troops and logistics would be decisive in the last campaigns. Yet their entry did not magically end stalemate. It amplified existing momentum. The German spring offensives of 1918, led operationally by figures such as Ludendorff, were a gamble. Strike hard and fast before American presence could be fully felt. Initially, they gained ground, exploiting localized numerical advantages and temporary tactical surprise. But the offensives exhausted German reserves, bled the army of momentum, and left its lines brittle. The Allied counteroffensives that followed, coordinated under leaders who recognized the need to combine fresh American manpower with the hardened veterans of France and Britain, reversed the German gains. The 100 Days Offensive pushed relentlessly, combining artillery barrages with more flexible infantry tactics, rolling artillery, and improved coordination with tanks and aircraft. The result was a collapse in German capacity to sustain the fight. Internally, Germany faced mounting unrest, economic collapse, political ferment, and the erosion of authority. In November 1918, the military and political order in Germany unraveled, the Kaiser fled, and an armistice ended the fighting on the Western Front. But an armistice is not a settlement. The cessation of hostilities removed one form of killing, but left the structural puzzles unresolved. The treaties that followed, above all the Treaty of Versailles, attempted to convert wartime victories into a peacetime order. The Versailles terms imposed territorial adjustments, reparations, and a legal assignment of responsibility that included the so-called war guilt clause. Many contemporaries perceived these terms as humbling and punitive. Diplomats hoped to create a sustainable peace, but the treaty also planted resentments and a sense of injustice among the defeated. Empires were dismantled. The Austro-Hungarian colossus unraveled into nation-states. The Ottoman domains were parceled and reimagined, and the map of Central and Eastern Europe was redrawn. The treaty system sought to create a new order, but in the process reshaped political grievances. Yet to understand the post-war map, we must return to wartime promises and secret diplomacy. In rooms far from the trenches, officials had made commitments that did not always align. The Sykes-Picot agreements, arrangements for dividing Ottoman lands between European powers, ran counter to British promises of Arab independence, made to several Arab leaders during the war. The Balfour Declaration, a public statement endorsing a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine, introduced another variable to a region already subject to competing claims. These wartime diplomatic maneuvers, some secret, some public, produced expectations among local populations that collided with imperial interests. The transcript emphasizes these contradictions, promises and public declarations that failed to cohere with each other or with the eventual settlement, leaving behind contested national aspirations and sources of grievance. The wartime record also includes a painful catalog of civilian suffering that textbooks often understate. Blockades, food shortages, forced deportations, and violent reprisals affected non-combatant populations across multiple theaters. The transcript notes, for example, the mass killing and deportations of Armenians during the war, and specifically records that the characterization of those events is disputed by the Turkish government. That phrasing is important. The events had an immense human toll, and the political contestation around their interpretation is part of the historical record. Similarly, civilian fatalities and famine-like conditions resulting from blockade and economic collapse claimed countless lives in places that rarely make it into abbreviated classroom treatments. Colonial casualties and disruptions were enormous and complex. Labor conscription, forced portering, and disease took a heavy toll in African and Asian theaters. The war's demands redirected resources away from peacetime agricultural and social needs, exacerbating shortages and social tensions. In many colonies, the experience of wartime mobilization produced heightened political expectations. Soldiers and laborers who had served or supported the imperial war effort came home to claim recognition, political rights, or reform. Where promises were broken or never intended to be fully honored, colonial grievance solidified. This mismatch between wartime expectations and post-war realities helped fuel independence movements and new political ideologies in the decades that followed. The economic aftermath also merits attention. The war was not only a physical catastrophe, but a fiscal one. States financed conflict through borrowing, inflation, and the redirection of productive capacity toward wartime needs. The inflationary pressures and fiscal burdens of the post-war years compounded political instability. Reparations, debt, and the costs of rebuilding turned wartime sacrifice into peacetime hardship for many societies, creating political openings for radicals and nationalists alike. The economic dimensions of the settlement fed narratives of betrayal and injustice that political entrepreneurs exploited in the 1920s and 1930s. Revolution and counter-revolution were structural consequences of this breakdown. Russia's 1917 experience, the abdication of Tsar Nicholas II, the provisional government's brief rule, and the Bolshevik seizure of power reflected how social strains and military collapse could translate into political transformation. The Bolsheviks' promise of peace, land, and bread resonated with exhausted soldiers and dispossessed peasants. Their withdrawal from the war via a separate peace altered the strategic landscape in the East and intensified diplomatic calculations in the West. The collapse of imperial authority in Austria-Hungary and the Ottoman Empire produced new national claims, ethnic conflicts, and political experiments. Some of these experiments produced fragile democracies, others long-lived grievances, and still others cycles of violence. Two observations should be emphasized. First, these political ruptures were connected to the structural dynamics of the war. Mobilization, economic strain, dislocation, and the mass experience of violence had radicalizing effects. Second, many contingencies mattered. Local actors made choices, foreign powers intervened, and wartime promises shaped expectations. The war's institutional momentum created conditions for revolution, but revolution itself had agency and produced its own trajectories. As the decade closed, a contested peace was visible everywhere. The map had been redrawn, but the social and political fabric remained raw. New states emerged, some with tenuous ethnic compromises. Mandates and colonial administrations extended European oversight in new forms. Populations that had been promised self-determination now found themselves subject to new external arrangements. The bitterness of the settlement, the mix of punishment, reward, and strategic calculation left behind a field of unresolved claims. This entire sequence returns us to the central claim. The shocking truth of World War I is less a single hidden story than a set of structural dynamics and choices that made escalation and unprecedented suffering more likely. Four intertwined truths: the alliance trap and mobilization timetables, industrialized slaughter, the global reach of the conflict, and secret diplomacy with its broken promises, explain how a local crisis turned into a worldwide catastrophe and why the post-war order proved so unstable. Consider alliances and mobilization anew. Treaties intended to deter aggression became, when combined with inflexible mobilization plans, triggers that reduced the space for peaceful negotiation. The rhythm of rail timetables and the logic of military planning compressed time and transformed responses into near-automatic actions. That compression of decision time meant that political leaders, even when they desired restraint, often faced the stark choice between presiding over a strategic withdrawal and risking military collapse. The institutional designs that were meant to defend states thus became mechanisms for escalation. Consider industrialized slaughter. The integration of factories, rail networks, and mass conscription turned organized violence into an economy. Victory depended more on industrial stamina than on the quality of individual generals. That reorientation created political and moral dilemmas: how to sustain a population's willingness to endure mass casualties, how to allocate scarce labor and resources, and how to maintain legitimacy in the face of enormous loss. The methods created by necessity, ever larger barrages, new chemical agents, mass infantry attacks supported by creeping artillery and tanks, changed the nature of war from episodic violence into sustained societal mobilization. Consider the global reach. Colonial theaters were not mere adjuncts. They were strategic extensions of European conflict. They drew local populations into the vortex, exposed them to new forms of coercion, and planted seeds of political change. The empire's war required colonial manpower and resources. Colonial subjects who served often returned with heightened demands for rights or autonomy. Whether in Africa, the Middle East, or Asia, the war's shocks recalibrated imperial relationships and animated subsequent independence movements. Consider secret diplomacy. The war's backroom deals and wartime assurances created a web of expectations that collided with public declarations and local aspirations. Sykes-Picot, Balfour, and other maneuvers did not simply redraw maps. They altered the legitimacy of post-war arrangements for many people on the ground. Broken promises and overlapping commitments fed instability and resentment that would complicate peace for decades. If we step back, we see how these threads connect across time. The same institutional forms that multiplied violence in 1914-1918, alliance networks, mobilization schedules, industrial production, and clandestine bargaining, did not disappear with the armistice. They reappeared in altered forms in the interwar years. The settlement sought to manage these dynamics, but in many cases hardened grievances into geopolitical realities. That is the uncomfortable but necessary lesson. The war's worst surprises were not merely that people fought or that technologies killed more efficiently. The real shock was how ordinary political instruments and administrative routines were harnessed into a machine of destruction. In this light, the common textbook narrative,
A chain reaction of mistakes or a single villain is incomplete. Institutional momentum, structural constraints, and layered commitments made catastrophe more likely. The human stories remain indispensable to this structural reading. Men who marched in 1914 and returned years later, when they returned at all, found societies transformed. Women who entered wartime factories discovered new economic roles and new social possibilities. Colonized soldiers who fought under imperial flags returned to metropolis that often continued to treat them unequally. Bereaved families in cities and villages improvised ways to survive. For all the maps and diplomatic notes, the war's tangible legacy is the reshaping of countless private lives. Finally, what does this history mean for us now? First, it cautions against simplistic cause-effect accounts of major conflicts. Multiple mechanisms interact in ways that are often nonlinear. Second, it shows the dangers of institutional rigidity. Timetables and inflexible plans can close off humane options. Third, it warns that secret bargains, however expedient in the moment, can generate durable resentment. And fourth, it reminds us that the global dimensions of seemingly local disputes amplify consequences in unpredictable ways. The title of this narrative promised a shocking truth. The shock is not a single hidden plot, but an accumulation of structural processes and choices that converted politics into industrialized killing. That insight does not absolve individual responsibility, it contextualizes it. Leaders, officers, diplomats, and publics all made choices. But choices were made within frameworks that amplified certain outcomes and attenuated others. Recognizing those frameworks complicates moral judgment and deepens our understanding of how such a disaster could unfold. If we are to learn anything, it must be this. Mitigation of future catastrophes depends not only on better moral leadership, but on the design of institutions that allow time for deliberation, that avoid automatic triggers for escalation, that maintain transparency in diplomacy, and that resists the inclination to conceive of national security as a pure function of industrial endurance. The lessons of 1914 to 1918 are therefore technical and ethical, strategic and human. We close not with certainty, but with a sober invitation. Read the maps, examine the timetables, study the diplomatic cables, and look again at the global theaters and the populations who bore war's burdens. The primary sources and scholarship linked in the description below provide the documentary trail for these claims. If this evidence-based deep dive has reshaped how you think about the conflict once described as the war to end all wars, explore the sources and the related videos in our playlist.
Subscribe for the full series and the referenced materials so that together we can keep asking the difficult questions history deserves.